Hi, everybody. For this week, I have just a very quick overview of the Frankfurt School and kind of the key points of the Adorno and Horkheimer culture industry essay. Um, so this won't be long, just a few notes here. So this is about the Frankfurt School, and what the Frankfurt School was it was an institute that was founded for the study of critical inquiry using critical theory. More on the school itself in just a moment. Critical theory is basically a focused critique of culture, capital, and modernism. This was especially important around the turn of the 20th century and in the early decades of the 20th century as modernism overtook culture. Now, what we mean here is that we're talking about systems, right? So industrialization, new modes of transport, new communications technologies, including things like the telegraph and telegraphy and the radio and motion pictures, as well as just things like automobiles and trains and all sorts of new stuff, newspapers, okay? Now, this mode of critical theory is underpinned by Marxist theories of labor and capital. We'll talk more about this on Thursday in our synchronous session, but the idea here is that Marxism, especially for theoretical purposes, is simply a means of understanding history, okay? So it's understanding history in its relations between capital, labor, and culture, okay? And trying to understand what happened. It is not necessarily an argument for a revolution, okay? The idea that Marx had that was then adopted by communism and socialism was that labor and capital have a specific relationship through history that is cyclical, and every single time that cycle starts to break and then begins anew, there is a further instance of us getting towards what he calls a communist utopia, whereby everybody enjoys the fruits of their labor and none of the ills of capitalism, where money is funneled to the top and to private companies, okay? So that being said, this is not simply reduced to ideas of communism or socialism. It's literally just how can we understand what's happening now by looking to the past and understanding these systems, okay? Marxist theories of culture are really the foundations of anything tangentially related to cultural studies. And this mode of critical theory is very important for us to understand in this class, because as we move along into TV studies, fan studies, things like that, you'll start to put together all these different nodes that are kind of tying back, okay? So while this is especially in this essay, kind of difficult to wrap your head around a little bit just because of the way that they're writing, it's important just to have like a foundational understanding of it, okay? So what then was the Frankfurt School? Well, it was founded in the 1920s in Frankfurt, Germany, and the intent was to bring together a lot of different types of theorists and scholars and philosophers who all used Marxist critical theory to create an interdisciplinary research center. Okay, so it was a school of cultural studies. And the idea was that you were going to generate critiques of culture and ideology underpinned by the specifics of time and place. Okay, so like a very historically grounded and then very present understanding of what was going on with culture, and to understand ideology, what ideology is, how it's formed, and how it perpetuates itself, okay? So like I said in the previous slide, this is a foundational theory and a set of theories that's important for quite a few significant liberal arts disciplines: cultural studies, gender studies, feminism, queer theory, television studies, critical race theory. The list goes on and on. You cannot really perform critique of culture and art and media in the same way if you do not understand how to do this. And that's what the Frankfurt School is good for instructing us to do, okay? So let's talk a little bit about the culture industry. So Adorno and Horkheimer were German Jews. They lived in Germany until the 1930s. The entire Frankfurt School kind of relocated to New York in 1933 once the Nazis ascended to power. But the Frankfurt School also, aside from Adorno and Horkheimer, was home to some prominent thinkers of the time. Siegfried Kracauer was a part of the Institute. Walter Benjamin was a part of it. If you have taken film theory, you've already read some of that stuff. At least Benjamin, that one's taught everywhere, the work of art in the age of technological reproduction, that essay. And what Adorno and Horkheimer are doing in this essay is that they are critiquing mass culture generally in the modern era to talk about dominant ideological strains, okay? So in order to understand where they're coming from, you kind of have to understand where they were. So Germany in the 1920s, at the time that they were writing this and thinking about it before they actually published it, all this time when they were young thinkers and philosophers was a time of turmoil in Germany. Germany was a young country. It was not actually a country until the late 1800s. Unlike the United States or even France at that point, which had had a full-on constitutional democracy some time before. Germany up until the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s was really just a collection of different kingdoms and states. So you know some of these names: Bavaria, Prussia. And what happened is in the late 19th century, Germany formed into kind of a cohesive nation state. It was still a monarchy up through the end of World War I. And this period in between World War I and World War II is known as the Weimar era, where they founded a more liberal democratic socialist kind of government. Society was slightly more free. The problem was that because of a variety of different contexts, by the late 1920s, Germany was going bankrupt. People were out of work. And yet they still had to pay a lot of money. They owed money all over the place. And so while culturally things like German Expressionism were having a huge impact globally, including in the United States, on an artistic scale, the country itself was kind of crushed under the weight of needing to generate capital to pay back all the nations for World War I, because it had kind of been blamed entirely. And so as that's happening, right, you have economic depression, you have civil unrest, and what happens is the far right, the Nazis, the fascists, start to take over all these different systems within the country, okay? So what they're seeing is collapses in their country of the law, of the idea of a nation state as something that was bringing together people as opposed to excluding people. Because of course, the first people, anytime there is an economic crisis, that get blamed for anything are minorities. They're easy to scapegoat. Immigrants, easy to scapegoat. You can treat them as outsiders. You can pass laws against them. And so all of this was happening in the lead up to 1933, when most of these people fled the country, and Nazis under Adolf Hitler really started to consolidate their power. Okay, so this is kind of what they're seeing happen. And it's really important to understand that in spite of the name, the Nazi Party was not a socialist party. They had infiltrated numerous socialist parties throughout the 1920s to take them over and leave them standing kind of in name only as socialist parties. And what they were really generating was not socialist in the way that we understand it, but what Nazism and fascism ultimately become are kind of like state-run capitalist enterprises. Okay, so they're going to take over the capitalist enterprise and make sure that it runs efficiently, but it's still going to reap private profitability and so on and so forth, as well as generate both goodwill for the ruling party because, hey, they're helping the economy recover. But more importantly, it's going to kind of keep everybody in line because they need to reproduce their own ideology. Okay, and this is where Adorno and Horkheimer step in. And so they look at all this that's going on politically. They look at everything that's happening in the United States, where we kind of, after World War I, really start a hardline shift away from the left politically. And if you take history of television or you take film history, and we'll talk more about this on Thursday, what you'll see is that within each of these industries, there becomes gradually, throughout the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, more and more and more interaction and interdependency between the US government and systems of private capital. And they're taking a look at all of this from their position of writing this essay in Europe, the US, and they're thinking through the issues and the problems. Okay, so if they're thinking about this as a critique of mass culture and ideology, what they do in this essay is they really focus in on the synchronization that starts to occur, the automation between labor and leisure time, okay? So I know that this is probably difficult to get out of this essay on first pass, but we'll go through the big bits in a minute. They really are saying that labor and leisure time actually start to overlap so much that they change culture. Culture starts to flatten out of multiculturalism, right? Something that is vibrant and fun and interactive and can generate new modes of thinking and new exciting pieces of art. It starts to flatten it because everybody starts to have the same experiences. They start to enjoy things en masse, right? So this idea of mass culture is very new. And they use a lot of different types of popular media and cultural objects to ask a series of questions and to come up with some answers, right? So who makes the decisions about things that are produced, how we spend our time, what our labor is, who produces that, right? So is it the company owner that produces the value? Is it the laborer that produces the value? Who benefits? Laborer, owner, and who consumes? Laborer, owner. And this is kind of what they do rhetorically throughout the essay. They kind of make a point, and then they return to the start, and then they ask those questions again, and they work through paragraph by paragraph. So if it was a little disjointed, it's a rhetorical strategy at play, right? It's not just starting point A, point B, and working through like thesis paragraph and 5-paragraph essay like we learned in high school. This is a rhetorical essay where they keep making the same point over and over and over. And by the end, it's about the accumulation of all of that to be, and this is what we're talking about. Okay, so the last thing I do want to hit here is they come up with some pretty big ideas, and we'll talk more about these in our synchronous session, but let's just get them on the table. So the things that they come up with by analyzing like film, popular music, is that the structures of capitalism can only reproduce themselves. They cannot reproduce any other type of structure, okay? It cannot innovate outside of the generation of further capital. So that labor is further automated. This results in further alienation of the worker from their labor. Leisure time is increasingly measured out in timed increments, right? So we're going to go and watch a movie for an hour and a half. We're going to go and eat, and lunch is going to take 40 minutes. That sort of thing, so that our leisure time is no longer ours, and instead what we start doing is using our leisure time to spend money to generate further economic buoyancy and wealth for owners of capital, which in their understanding of ideology is also replicating the dominant structures of the capitalist nation state, right? So in this system, leisure activities themselves are valued as labor. So we produce for the companies even when we are not working, okay? Does that sound familiar to y'all? And so ergo, the cultural products that we consume, the movies we watch, the songs we listen to, how we listen to them on the radio, on the television, in the cinema, they reproduce and replicate the dominant modes of production under capitalism, which also reproduces and replicates the dominant ideologies of consumption and labor value of the dominant parties that run the country, okay, and who control wealth and power. So not replicating the ideology of the minorities for the masses, not replicating an ideology of working class values for the masses, but instead the idea is that, for example, now maybe you're going to get online and you're going to defend someone like Elon Musk just from simple criticism, okay? Or you're going to get on and defend Jeff Bezos from simple criticism, okay? You have no personal investment in that because you are not part of that structure. We think of ourselves as part of that structure. We might aspire to be part of that structure, but the reasons we aspire to it, the reasons we view ourselves that, right, they would say is that you have fallen into exactly the system that capitalism and culture in collusion with one another, when you're talking about mass culture, not subcultures, not necessarily anti-mass culture movements. What we're talking about is dominant culture replicates itself and the ideologies that will allow it to grow and to replicate for infinity, okay? And that's what they're talking about here. So when we come to class on Thursday, I'll have some examples of what they were looking at the time, and we can talk very specifically about this. But I just wanted y'all to have kind of a compact understanding of both what Marxist critical theory's goals were, as well as what this essay in specific was trying to get at, okay? Because I do know that it's very dense. So hopefully this helped, and I'll see you all in class.